Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you for inviting me to present this lecture. I am very happy to participate in the Polonium Foundation lecture series. So today I would like to talk about my forthcoming book, tentatively titled Imagining the World, Youth and the Global Sixties in Poland, 1954 to 1974. The book could be seen as a series of essays. In fact, this was an assessment of one of the reviewers for the press. So it's a kind of a series of essays that broadly aim at rethinking post-1945 Polish history. I am looking at post-war Poland by placing the subjectivity of young people and their engagement with international youth culture at the center of the story. Let me now go to my PowerPoint. Okay, it works, right? I hope. Yes?
Yes, everything works, yes.
Okay, good. So many scholars have argued that youth in the modern era has been a quintessentially transnational group. The very sociological concept of youth culture, which took shape in the 1950s and mainly in Great Britain and the US, took place in the context of the accelerated commercial culture and exchange of ideas across borders. So in other words, rather than looking at young people in Poland as subjects to a totalitarian regime, which is the kind of a conventional approach to study youth or any other group in communist Poland, I reposition them as active participants of global conversations, from non-conformist lifestyles, experimentation with consumer products and technology, counterculture, and leftist politics. So today, I would like to focus on one theme that is in many ways central to my book. I would like to talk about youth magazines, which was a new genre in Poland that emerged in the 1950s during the thaw, in the mid-1950s. And it was a site of interaction between domestic forms of leisure and consumption and international youth culture. So let me now show an outline of my book. That's just to give you an idea what the whole book is about. So today I will be talking about chapter 3, although the youth magazines are actually they appear in every chapter. They are central to my analysis in general. So let me start by giving you some background on the concept of the Global Sixties, which now is a separate field in historical studies. This project originated a long time ago. In 2007, in June, I went to a wonderful conference in Kingston, Ontario in Canada. If anyone is planning to move to Canada, that's a beautiful place. The conference was called New World Coming, the 60s and the Shaping of Global Consciousness. And there were about 500 papers presented at that conference, and only 2 of them talked about Eastern Europe. One of them was my paper on Poland, and there was another one on Czechoslovakia. So at that point, I decided that something has to be done about this. Let's find out if Eastern Europe had the Global 60s. What do I mean by global, and what do usually historians mean when they speak about the Global 60s? So the global points to the significance of interaction between global and local forces. The Global 60s do not denote the decade of the 1960s. So they do not start in 1961 and end in 1970. It's a conceptual framework and a methodology. The Global Sixties build on the concept of the long 60s, coined by British historian Arthur Marwick in the early 2000s. And the long 60s usually place the beginning of the 60s somewhere in the mid-1950s and then the end in the early 1970s. We can talk about these chronological boundaries later on. But the scholarly and popular literature on the long 60s has typically concentrated on Western Europe and the United States as the sites of unprecedented cultural liberalization and political radicalism. And of course, 1968 is central to this kind of narrative. More recently, however, scholars have turned to the global south and the transnational dimension of the 60s. So now they explore the cross-border interaction of people, ideas, images, and activism. So I am building on that scholarship. I challenge isolationist narratives of life in the Eastern Bloc and argue that the rapidly globalizing world of the 60s necessitated confrontation with outside developments, while the very ideas of global interconnectedness shaped youth behavior and state response. And one common desire that young people in Poland expressed consistently from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s and probably beyond was the desire and demand for foreign travel. And also the desire to interact with global youth culture and with the global youth community beyond the Iron Curtain. Okay, so how do youth magazines play into this? And what is the politics of apolitics? So the phrase apolitics serves to underline this new genre of youth magazines, which were specifically designed to be apolitical. They were intended to focus on leisure and entertainment. And this term apolitical emerged during the thaw to signal a different attitude towards young people. After 1956, when Stalinism in Poland was dismantled, and when the national communist Władysław Gomułka came to power, the party state redefined its approach to young people. So young people were no longer considered to be the avant-garde of the revolution, but rather the state recognized young people as a diverse social group with multiple needs, desires, and aspirations. So they de-emphasized political and ideological agendas in favor of cultural activity, educational leisure, and cultivating socialist commitments to a collective well-being. And this was considered to be part of socialist modernity, a modernity alternative to the capitalist one. The term globalization was not yet part of the Polish vocabulary during that time, but commentators often spoke about integration. And they spoke about the integration of the technological cultural base as a defining feature of a new type of civilization of the second half of the 20th century. So this was connected to the policy of the so-called peaceful coexistence conducted by the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, starting in the post-Stalinist era. The policy that basically aimed at the de-escalation of the Cold War and moving the competition between East and West to peaceful areas such as consumption, the standard of living, cultural diplomacy, and so on. So I am showing some examples of youth magazines in Poland. The first one from the left is Etc. or ITD, which was a student magazine that started in 1960. The one in the middle, Radar, was internationally oriented by definition. It was aimed at presenting the material on international youth movements and international youth culture to the Polish audience. and then Around the World, which started publishing in 1954. The spread of the mass media after World War II is particularly important. New technology, print culture, radio and television have the capacity to transmit images and information about many different parts of the world to many different parts of the world. So youth magazines were often called by young people in Poland windows to the world. These magazines were produced by state publishing houses, and yet it is possible to look at them and to look at the popular press in general, not as a product of state propaganda, but as a site of negotiation for different actors, editors, journalists, politicians, censors, and readers. So the state sought to shape youth culture, but it also responded to youth desires and aspirations. Youth magazines embraced selected elements of global youth culture, for example, rock and roll, music, movie stars, in an effort to create a socialist version of modernity. So in this way, the state inadvertently created an environment in which new ways of imagining the young selfhood became possible. And the story of these magazines starts in 1954, in January, which is less than a year after the death of Stalin. A new Polish magazine, Around the World, appeared on the newsstands. Its colorful cover, you saw the cover before, immediately stood out because it was different from other publications at the time. The content was even more surprising since it did not feature explicit ideological messages that were expected under Stalinism, but rather the magazine created a sensation among the reading public. A contemporary writer and journalist, Leopold Tillman, recorded in his diary, this is from January 1954, Warsaw has new fun, a newly launched by the regime weekly titled Around the World. Today, the third issue of this magazine came out and was literally scrambled from newsstands within less than an hour. And then Tillman asked, well, what caused its popularity? And his answer was the following. The reason is very simple. This magazine is 95% cleared from a political propaganda. It's an imitation of all kinds of entertainment, sensational press of the world. Sports, short stories, a lot of reportage from real life, from games, from entertainment, pictures from parties, cafes, and restaurants. Practical advice, funnies, this is sufficient. Warsaw, and especially the youth, is starving for this sort of the press, and hence its popularity. So I quoted this diary entry at length because it illustrates several points. First, the power of popular culture in the process of dismantling Stalinism, in the process of political change. Second, the role of transnational exchanges across the Iron Curtain in the age of the mass media. And third, the unexpected complicity of the communist regime in facilitating the interaction between young people and the outside world. Magazines like Around the World, in fact, disseminated positive images of the West, and this was happening in Cold War Poland. Another turning point came in 1955. During the World Youth Festival in Warsaw in the summer of 1955, at the time approximately 127,000 young people from 116 countries descended on the Polish capital. The festival became an unprecedented youth carnival and celebration of cultural diversity. And what's interesting, in the wake of the festival, there was a powerful public campaign on the part of young people to demand easing travel restrictions thousands of young people flooded the state's passport bureau with applications. They demanded that international travel became an integral part of socialist education. And in fact, this new magazine at the time, new magazine around the world, was endorsing that campaign. They became part of campaigning on behalf of young readers to make foreign travel more possible. Even though travel restrictions became more relaxed after 1956, for the vast majority of young people through the 1960s, the interaction with the world took place in the sphere of imagination and often through the images projected by the mass media, such as the popular magazines. And it is important, I think it's especially significant, the print culture, the youth magazines were especially significant in the East European context because of the limits on interaction with personal interaction with international actors. So they became vehicles for transnational imagination. So this is an example of an issue of the Dookoła Świata, or Around the World, from 1959. It's a vacation issue. So let me just say a few words about those magazines. Around the World printed 400,000 copies. The student magazine, etc., 60,000 copies. Radar, 60,000 copies. So we have these circulation numbers, but they say little about the readership, because this is not a society based on free market or the supply and demand rules. These magazines were extremely popular and more accessible to young people than the circulation numbers suggest. So, for example, they could be found in public libraries, in villages and small towns. And if one got hands on one of those magazines, the copy would usually circulate among friends, family, and neighbors for months, if not years. So now let me go over several trends and images from youth magazines that suggest how young people were encouraged to think of themselves as part of the world by the very state that also restricted travel and restricted other interaction with the world or with the West. Okay, so some examples of articles and images from youth magazines. Here you can see Around the World from August 1964. Youth magazines featured a substantial amount of material on Western Europe and the US. Most of that material focused on youth culture, music, fashion. Some, in fact, were reprints and translations of articles and images from the British, French, or American magazines. In this way, youth magazines reinforced the notion that the West was the core of youth culture. So here we have the Beatles. Here we have instructions on how to dance the twist. And this is a magazine intended for teenage girls, Filipinka, which started publishing in 1957. And again, I mean, it's an example of promoting leisure, entertainment, and the West as the core of youth culture. This is one of my favorite magazine covers. We have Brigitte Bardot, who is writing her New Year's greetings to the readers of Radar. So here you have a Bardot is wishing Happy New Year to the readers of Radar, Happy New Year 1968. So here we have a connection between the Polish audience and the outside world made very explicit. The young Polish audience was told that they were participants in this global enterprise of entertainment. Bardot is addressing them directly. In addition, there were also efforts to introduce young people to the post-colonial world. On the pages of Around the World and other youth magazines, the so-called Third World appeared in the form of news bits, recipes for African dishes, reportage, color photographs of exotic places and people, travel reports, and also reports on the state visits by Polish political officials to newly decolonized nations in Africa and Asia. So here we see the Polish Prime Minister, Józef Cyrankiewicz, who visited, who toured Southeast Asia, and here we, South Asia actually, here we have him in Burma, the Polish delegation visiting Burma. His wife was a recognized Polish female actor, Nina Andrich. So this is 1957, May. And the message in those reports was quite interesting. It was not so much anti-colonialism as one may suspect, given the communist commitment to anti-imperialist struggle. Poles were believed to have a special relationship to newly decolonized nations. So it was not so much about socialism that they represented to third world leaders and ordinary citizens, but rather the passion for the national liberation struggle. So the reports usually claim that people in the post-colonial world loved Poland and the Poles. They were huge admirers of Poland. And you have an example of one of those color reportage that were often featured in popular magazines. So the Prime Minister Cyrankiewicz and his wife touring Burma, Cambodia, and India were featured and depicted as this couple being followed by cheering crowds waving Polish flags. And the report said, everywhere in meetings with politicians, scientists, and workers, the Polish delegation was greeted and hosted wholeheartedly. The President of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, explained the reasons for such ovation, and here I quote, "We are greeting the Polish Prime Minister so wholeheartedly because he is the Prime Minister of a country which loves national independence as much as we do," end of quotation. So anti-colonial struggles became part of popular culture and were often depicted in gendered ways. So, for example, the symbol of the Cuban Revolution on the pages of youth magazines was not Fidel Castro, but a beautiful woman. In December 1962, the cover of the magazine Etc., the student magazine, featured a gorgeous young woman dressed in a uniform of the Brigadas Conrado Benitez, and this blonde Cuban girl was said to carry the torch of education to the nation. So she was taking part in the literacy campaign. But this phrase, the torch of education, has a special meaning in the Polish context because it has been usually used when talking about young women who went to the countryside in the 19th century during the era of partitions to educate peasant children in Polish language and culture. Now we also have, this is a feature of youth magazines, especially prominent in the Etc., but also in Around the World, collages of political and entertainment news. And I find them really interesting. So often political messages appeared in close proximity to the entertainment content. In this particular image, it's not very clear, so I don't know if you can see you can probably see the photographs, but not so much the text. But for example, here we at the top we have information about the first elections in independent Algeria. This is September 1962. We also have some information about a Polish youth delegation visiting the United States. But just to the right, we have other information which has nothing to do with politics, but it's really about gossip, and it's about celebrities. So, for example, you probably can recognize Brigitte Bardot again. The subheading over Bardot photograph read, "Bibi changed her bathing suit." And the short note explained that the French actress stopped wearing her bikini due to a water skiing incident in which she fell and lost her bra. And just to the right of that story, and below the short note on the titled, the short note titled, "The US is renewing nuclear explosions at high altitudes," there were 3 photographs of attractive women fashioning themselves after the female character of the newly released film Lolita. The title above, "A Baby Bomb," was a wordplay of the commonly used sex bomb. And also this idea of putting together nuclear explosions. So we have information about the nuclear explosions. And then the sex bomb is placing these kinds of images, the nuclear bomb and the sex bomb or the bombshell, an attractive sexualized female, was quite common in the American and Western European magazines. So what is most striking about these collages is not so much the mix of themes and places that transcended Cold War divisions and clearly placed Polish subjects within the global context. Rather, it was the lack of clear guidance for the reader to interpret these images. So collages of political news and celebrity gossip from all over the world suggested that Polish citizens were encouraged to think of themselves as part of this global audience, but their particular political or ideological position within that audience was ambiguous. Collages featured in etc. or other popular periodicals provided images and information, but really no clear map or direction on how to read them. In conclusion, one way to look at these youth magazines is to say that youth magazines were designed to accommodate global youth culture, to show that the Polish state is not afraid of new trends in youth culture. On the contrary, the state shows confidence, at least before 1968, in selective borrowing and accommodating Western trends. But another way to look at these images is to ask about the interaction between the global and the domestic. Youth magazines encourage the audience to think about the world, but also to situate themselves in that world as Poles. But what would that mean? The 60s marked a critical time in Poland and Eastern Europe when people confronted cultural globalization before they would enter economic globalization of the 1970s, the 1980s, and beyond. Now, political leaders themselves felt ambivalent about promoting global youth culture. I looked at the correspondence between the party press bureau and the editors of these magazines, and it's a quite interesting reading. The press bureau was basically telling the editors, well, you have to change the content. You cannot feature so much material on the West. So they didn't like this celebrity gossip. And the editors were saying, well, we have to adjust to the audience. The audience wants this kind of stuff. And also our magazines are apolitical. They are leisure and entertainment oriented. So we cannot have explicit political messages. So those discussions are quite interesting. But basically they are not very effective because the content of the magazines has not really changed over the 1960s. But this ambivalence and anxiety about what images of the world or global youth culture might do to young people in Poland became visible in March 1968 when students and youth demonstrations erupted all over Poland. Although the protests had little to do with youth magazines, the protests triggered a powerful campaign against youth culture and including the youth, this kind of youth magazines and consumer culture in general. And this was part of the anti-Semitic campaign that was launched against the protesters after the demonstrations in 1968. So it included the attack on youth culture, cosmopolitanism, leftism, consumerism, and all of this was clumped together with Marxist revisionism. So this is my last image. So this vilification of new trends in fashion, sociability, rock and roll, blue jeans, American cigarettes, and Western clothes experienced a huge backlash in 1968 when a political protest was associated with the detrimental effect of youth culture on the minds of young people. And youth magazines, in fact, were blamed explicitly for promoting lifestyles and ideas that were incongruent with socialist values. So this is an example of an attack on global youth culture, the struggle of youth. It's a youth periodical that was more ideologically oriented, who we don't want to be. And of course, we don't want to be this woman with the cigarette in her mouth. But the backlash was short-lasting. In the 1970s, after the new leader came to power, Edward Gierek, youth magazines became even more consumer-oriented, consumer culture-oriented. And they focused even more heavily on the so-called apolitical entertainment. I will end here, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, so maybe I will moderate question part a bit. You can either raise a hand and I will unmute you if you want to ask a question directly, or you can post it in a chat and I will read it out loud. Okay. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the presentation. Really interesting. I'm looking forward to your book on the 1960s. I have a question about the reasons for the party leadership to approve, make decisions to establish these magazines in the late 1950s. Have you found any documents about it? Have you found any, Politburo protocol or the Central Committee of the Communist Party, Department of Culture, discussing it. Was it more an expression of the acceptance that there is a private sphere in socialism, or was it invented as a vehicle to reach out to young people with this fancy, attractive images, but also combined with communist propaganda, such, you know, like anti-imperialist propaganda and so on? What, do you have an idea why the party agreed for that?
Should I answer each question, or are we?
Yes, I think so, because they might pile up.
Yes, that's a great question, and it's actually a difficult one, because it's hard to find any explicit pronouncements coming from the political officials regarding the magazines. So, there is a big public discussion in the early 1960s about the mass culture and the role of mass culture in a socialist society. And I think it's related to why this kind of material was accepted. So I would say that there was no clear-cut policy on how these youth magazines should look like, but they were a product of constant negotiations among different party leaders, and also between the editors and the readers. But in general, as you are saying, during the thaw, there was this acceptance of the private sphere and acknowledgement that people and young people had the right to leisure and entertainment and things that were not explicitly political and ideological. So this is part of that trend, and I was actually quite surprised that there was so little communist propaganda in those magazines. And they explicitly say, the editors and the journalists, in the correspondence with the party press bureau, that they are being apolitical, and that they don't want to be political, and all of this is apolitical. It's not affecting the beliefs and the minds of young people. It's basically, it's a natural desire to, you know, to have some fun and to engage in leisure. So, I mean, I see this as an ongoing conversation. It's very hard to pinpoint to, you know, some really clear-cut instructions or decisions about how this kind of material should look like.
Okay, now we have a question from Adrian. I'm unmuting you right now. Then we'll have question from Monica and then from Joanna. So just to... Adrian, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
So thank you very much. I started to write, but maybe that's easier to simply communicate. So thank you for this really amazing presentation. I would ask you, and I'd like to ask a different reading, strictly based on the same sources. So instead of focusing on what was presented, I would like to ask you what represents the absence. So you brought the example of the Beatles. The Beatles were basically present in all magazines, starting from Poland to Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. So it was an example which was at any time present in the late 60s. However, there was a strong absence about Rolling Stones or about Velvet Underground or these kind of groups. And when they were presented in very decadent nihilist terms, like, look what the capitalist countries do, whereas our countries won't have such people. And this leads to the second point, because then if you had these kind of references which are absent, but they're heard of from Radio Free Europe or from foreign magazines, which were present at that moment, I guess, in Warsaw at least, how did the individual reacted to this kind of information which was in other two types of sources, but not in the official magazine? So in other words, what was the role? Because you tell that at the beginning, the role of the subjectivity or the subjectivity formation, these magazines, but in comparison with other two youth channels, namely the Radio Free Europe and Foreign Press. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I didn't talk about the reception of those magazines, and it's difficult to talk about the responses because, well, we don't have many documents from the time registering the specific responses. But I would say that these magazines were extremely popular. And and in the interviews that I conducted a few years ago, people who were young in the 1960s remember these magazines as windows to the world, as basically giving them an idea of what was going on in other places. And you are right that the content was selected. It's not like, you know, every popular rock band would be featured. No, these were selected Western trends that were presented. But still, they gave, what they gave young people, I think, was the boost in imagining how the world beyond the iron culture, the Iron Curtain might look like. And yes, I mean, some of these people probably listened to Radio Luxembourg and to entertainment programs on Radio Free Europe. And I think that both kind of worked in tandem in shaping youth culture in Poland. I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, to me, I avoid making explicit claims about, oh, this contributed to the resistance or something like this. I think it's much more complicated because this was also evidence that the state took care of young people, that the state understood the needs of the young people. So, so it was more about shaping the relationship between the state and young people than contributed to any specific, I don't know what we would call political attitudes or resistance against the state. It was more about imagining the world and imagining the self in a new way.
Okay, so we have many questions, so maybe we can move to the next one. We have a question from Monica. I will read it because it was posted in a chat box. And Monica is thanking you for the talk. Maybe I will just read it out loud. I found the part about the collage interesting with the nuclear bomb and sex bomb. Was this a way for the youth to make these difficult world situations easier to understand, easier to accept? What do you think?
That's interesting. So this is as I was saying, this kind of pairing these kinds of images was very popular in the American popular press. And I think it was an effort to inscribe the Polish youth culture into the global, what was considered the global youth culture. So basically, an idea that we are not going to stay behind, that we know what is going on and how the popular culture is presented in the West. And we are kind of on the same page. I mean, to me, this is really the sort of integrating young people into this global audience. It's much more than making the difficult work situation easier. And I mean, this sort of commercialization of the political issues is part of the popular culture in the West during that time, cultural consumption. So basically, this is about being part that kind of consumer culture much more than about, you know, something helping people understand what's going on.
Right. I will thank you on behalf of Monica, and now I will give voice to Joanna. Hopefully I pronounced your name correctly.
Yeah, Johanna, it's okay.
Johanna, okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gosia, for your talk. It's very inspiring for my research as well. And I actually wanted to ask you about if you are researching the reception of the image, because it's very important part of the image. Of course, journalists kind of live in the society and they react on the society, they are part of it. And on the other hand, they are influencing, right, the readership and the society back. So it's kind of dialogue. And we need to understand the interaction if the readers are believing in what they are reading. And also that is linked, but I get that it's very problematic because of the sources. But I get to my second question, and that's, I'm interested how you define propaganda, because this I find quite problematic, as the images and all those news magazines during the communist regimes in various East European countries, this was deliberate, the content was deliberate, chosen, the tone was chosen by the state, kind of, right? So can't we say that it is a kind of propaganda, not a negative one, but very deliberate one, and not spontaneous? So the image of the West, to what extent do you find the image of the West spontaneous and real? Or is it, should we care if it's real, or should we just stay on the level, okay, those are images and people are imagining the world in the West? Yeah, so that's kind of my question to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. How do we define propaganda? So we are used to this definition of, you know, propaganda, political propaganda, as if there was, you know, some completely neutral presentation of news or popular culture in the West, right? But I mean, to some extent, all of these images are, to some extent, manipulations either of the party state or the corporations in the West, right? The marketing techniques and so on. So I don't see this. I definitely not. I am not making a contrast. Of course, there are differences, but what I'm saying is that there is no reality beyond a subjective reality, beyond what people imagine or what people present and want to believe you and want you to believe about these specific images. So to me, this is not. You can say that this is a different kind of propaganda because, especially if you compare this with the Stalinist period, when you have explicit ideological messages, calling on young people to worship the leader, calling on young people to join the youth organizations. You don't have that anymore in youth magazines. So there is this recognition that young people need what they call apolitical leisure. But at the same time, of course, you can notice politicized messages. But I mean, the same could be said about the West. You know, marketing techniques and advertisements also project political messages. So, so to me, this is really more of a conversation, even though the limits of that conversation are limited. I still see this as a dialogue and as a place where people could express their agency, even if restricted, including young people who are writing letters, who are consuming these images, and who are important in terms of the audience. I mean, the editors do care about what young people want.
Thank you very much.
It's a long topic.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe just a last note from my side, because what I had in mind is the reproduction, that actually those contents and this positive image of West actually help to reproduce the socialist regime, because you allow some access right? Some window to the West, and that helps paradoxically to the socialist regime as well.
Definitely, it works both ways. I mean, it could provoke desires to be part of the West, I don't know, to go to the West, but it could also send a very strong message that I don't need to go to the West, or I don't need, you know, to see the world, because the world is here. I can see it on the pages. Consuming images is very powerful. I can see it here, and, you know, the state is satisfying my needs for entertainment.
Thank you.
Okay, these webinars are planned for an hour, but we have still more questions. So if you don't mind, we could prolong it for extra 15 minutes. Okay, now we have question from Elżbieta, then from Anna, Natalia, and Tatiana, and I see some more questions. But let's start from Elżbieta, and if you can, please keep it short. Okay, I'm unmuting you. Okay, great.
Thank you for an indeed very interesting talk. And I would like to ask you about whether the Soviet Union was a part of the global imagination of Polish youth. I mean, both what was considered then as a center of the Soviet Union, like Moscow or Leningrad, or of its peripheries, like Caucasus, which might be exoticized back then. And what I must say I found striking in your presentation, in the sources you presented to us, was were the Russian words, which are not present today in Polish language, like kanikuły, and that those Russian words were related to describe the Western, what you meant as the Western imagination of the West, or the global imagination. So that was my question, whether the Soviet Union was a part of the imagination.
That's a great question. So when I read the correspondence between the press bureau, the party press bureau, and the editors, there was a constant talk on the part of the party, the constant questions: why are you not including more information and images on the Soviet Union and on other East European countries? This was a point of contention. And the editors were basically saying that, you know, they have to respond to the taste of the audience, and basically making an argument that the core of global youth culture is the West, not the East in any way. So this is very interesting. There was an effort to feature some material on the Soviet Union, for example, articles about Soviet students, about Soviet women with pictures, and so on. But it was limited, especially in comparison to the material on Poland or to the material on the West. So, so that was actually very interesting. And I also found another document. This was from the late 1950s, I think, in which when this Soviet magazine, Krai Rad, or the Country of Councils, was going to be published in, it was not a Soviet magazine, but it was a Polish magazine that was going to feature Soviet articles from the Soviet press, from the popular press. And in the instructions for the publication, basically party officials were saying, don't feature like reprints or literal translations of those articles, because the Polish audience is different. There is too much ideology, too much political content in the Soviet press. So they were basically advising to make this compilation of Soviet articles more, I don't know, digestible, or more, you know, more appealing to the Polish audience, which was very interesting. And basically, I mean, to me, it testifies to the fact that Poland was in many ways different from other countries in the Eastern Bloc and from the Soviet Union. And this was one of the differences. You know, more openness to the West in terms of presenting the West in neutral terms, because you don't really find a lot of descriptions when they feature the Beatles. There is not much about the decadence of the Beatles. I mean, there might be some ridiculing the Beatles, but it's kind of, you could feel the sort of admiration for, you know, for this kind of music and the celebrity status and so on. So
the global was the West, in short.
It's interesting. The world was the West mostly in the minds of young people. Although, as I'm saying, there were efforts to incorporate other parts of the world.
Thank you. That's very interesting indeed.
Dominika, you're muted.
Sorry. Now we have a question from Anna. I have unmuted you already, so go ahead.
Oh, I don't hear the question.
Neither do I. Anna, we can't hear you. Okay, maybe you can post it, and I will pass the mic to Natalia, and then we will move to your question, because we just can't hear you.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk, Gosia. I have two questions. I have two questions. One is, it's a huge question, but could you say something about how sexuality was discussed in this magazine? Because I know there were some experts talking about sexuality from the mid-60s. But I mean here, what was the general message about sexuality? Do you think that these magazines have, could have shaped some kind of sexual revolution in Poland in the 60s? And the other question is about censorship. Have you looked at censorship? What kind of topics were censored in these magazines? So thank you.
Okay, so the first question about sexuality, I have actually an extensive section in my book on sexual education and sexual revolution in Poland. So I would say that the youth magazines were pioneers in terms of discussing the topic, and the first articles about sexual education appeared in Radar in 1956, I believe, or 1957. So this was quite early, but they tended to be written by educators, writers, and they focused on the moral and emotional side of sexuality. The more explicit sexual advice starts in the late 1960s, especially in the student magazine, etc. It starts in 1967. So there is one, so there is this, to some extent, mission of the youth magazines to make young people, to educate young people about sexuality. And the articles from the late 1960s tend to be, well, conservative and misogynist in many ways. I'm not going to go into this, but I write about this in my book. Even as they are accepting premarital sex, for example. But in terms of expressing, they often emphasize gender difference. They have all these stereotypical views about female sexuality, about female submissiveness as being natural, and so on. So this was actually, reading that sexual advice is quite disturbing when you read that kind of stuff now. But it's interesting because there is a shift. In the late 1950s, the sexual advice, I would say, is much more liberal, especially towards women. For example, there is emphasis on women's reproductive rights in the late 1950s, but that changed. And another way in which sexuality is expressed in those magazines is actually presenting the female body in a very sexualized way, which again, not completely congruent with the socialist idea of gender equality or in general commodification of the body. But we have that, and starting in the late 1960s, actually, that there are pictures of nude women as featured in youth magazines as part of those, sort of a permanent part of those youth magazines. The second question about censorship. So I mean, in general, the popular publications were less censored than the daily press. I didn't look at the documents from the censorship office because I think that the process of censorship really was the most significant at the level of self-censorship. People, journalists, editors knew more or less what they could write about and what they could not write about. So, and I talked to journalists and editors who were involved in those processes. It was basically a matter between the editor-in-chief and the censorship office. But in terms of the content, I think the content was self-censored even before it went to any kind of other monitoring and censorship. And also the rules for censorship changed all the time. It was not clear what the rules were, except for one, that you could not write negatively about the Soviet Union. So everyone tells me this. They knew they could not write in negative terms about the Soviet Union. Everything else was sort of negotiable. But again, because these magazines describe themselves as apolitical, the censorship was less intrusive in general.
Okay, so Anna's question also regarded sexuality, so we just won't repeat it. So we can move to two last questions from Tatiana and Susan. The question from Tatiana goes as follows. Thanks for the great talk. I wonder if those magazines had a dialogue with the readers. Did they publish the letters from the readers? If so, what was the content of those letters? What they were concerned about?
That's a great question. So yes, they published letters, and the letters were often about there were different kinds of letters. So sometimes they would be about problems that young people face, romantic relationships, problems with parents, but there were also letters that were specifically about new trends in youth culture. So for example, people would write about the hippies and what they thought about the hippies. And then the letters or parts of the letters were featured, and there usually would be a commentary, basically giving some kind of commentary to the letters and guiding young people on how to correctly interpret the hippie movement or new hairstyles or fashion. So you did have that, and I don't. So to some extent we can see this as an ideological guideline, but to me this looks more like a moral guideline. It's the editors are teaching young people to uphold certain moral values, and there is also this sense and conviction on the part of the editors and the journalists that socialist societies, and especially youth in socialist societies, are morally superior to the West, and they need to cultivate this moral superiority that Western youth is into the bourgeois consumer culture. They are hedonist, sexually promiscuous, and so on. And the youth in socialist countries needs to be and is more morally oriented.
Okay, so I have last comment/question from Susan. Thank you very much. This research reveals even more why Poland was so attractive for the East German youth and art people starting during the 60s. the aspect of entertainment and cosmopolitization never really gained momentum. Well, especially not after the wall built in 1961. But generally, I'm wondering about your proposing that transnational perspective, because even with today's assessment, transnational is oriented to the West, but there is a transnational interrelational space within the East. I'm afraid this space has not been investigated enough at all. There is even a hesitance from colleagues from the former Eastern Bloc to tackle this context, either parallel to looking west or even before. I'm an art historian, and as such, I argue that defining unique and independent developments in the East can only be pointed out by first evaluating the Eastern context. So if you can reflect, it's more of a comment to what you tackled before, but I thought that I will give it just and read it out loud.
It's a great question and a long one for sure.
Yeah.
There are different definitions of transnationalism, and it's difficult. So the way I define, I don't talk that much about transnationalism, I guess, but okay, maybe I do. But so the way I approach transnationalism is, my study is situated within Poland. It's about young people in Poland. But I look beyond the national context. So to me, transnational is trying to transcend the national context and look at the outside influences. What was important for young people? What we see in documents, what we see in these products of cultural consumption. So in that way, it is limited. I think that yes, we need to investigate the relations within the Eastern Bloc, and we need to do more research on the interaction between different East European, I mean, in this case, young people or youth cultures. This is very important, but it's not. I mean, it's not the focus of my studies. So, I mean, to me, the way I use transnational is more kind of looking at the micro level, but at the same time looking at how this domestic context is being shaped by outside influences. And what I find is that it's mostly through these images of the West or the world. The Eastern Bloc or the Soviet Union are not as present in those products of cultural consumption. I don't know if that answers the question, but in general, we need more research on this sphere of life in general, because still the studies of Eastern Europe are very much dominated by political narratives and very kind of narrow national context. So, so definitely we need to change that.
Okay, I'm sure we have, as a community, we have many more questions, but I think that we shouldn't prolong it even further. So maybe I will end it here, and I would like to thank you for joining us at our webinars. I hope to see you soon, and maybe we'll be able to invite more guests from the humanities and social sciences to appeal a wider audience. I would like to thank our guest Gosia for joining us and sharing her research, and for all the interesting questions we have received today. Remember to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and sign up for our newsletter. if you want to stay in touch, and hopefully we see each other soon.